this week. Death and devastation in the Middle East as the Israeli military expands its ground offensive in Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is rejecting calls at home and abroad for a ceasefire. How and when will the war end? This week, we take a look at the pressure and tension building at the United Nations, inside Israel, in the United States, and on the streets of capitals around the world. Straight Talk Africa starts now. Hello there and welcome to a special edition of Straight Talk Africa on the Israel-Hamas War. We're coming to you from VOA's headquarters in Washington. I'm Hayde Adams. In the next half hour, we'll take a closer look at the geopolitical fallout from the crisis in the Middle East. From Gaza to Israel, civilians are counting the cost of conflict and the chaos in the Middle East as pressure builds around the world for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he won't press pause on Israel's ground push into Gaza, but could calls from some of the families of the hostages held by Hamas in Gaza complicate Israel's ground invasion in the Palestinian territory.
Israel's Prime Minister condemned a video that Hamas had released on Monday that shows 3 female hostages seized by the Islamist movement on October 7th. In the video, which is being watched on this phone, one of the hostages criticizes Benjamin Netanyahu for failing to protect Israeli citizens during the deadly attack and failing to get them back home. She purportedly calls for a deal to secure their release in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. Netanyahu, in a statement, condemned the clip from Hamas as cruel propaganda. Israel's leader is coming under pressure over his handling of the crisis. Dozens of people attended a protest in Tel Aviv to call for the hostages' release. Shiri Grossbard is a close friend of one of the hostages, Yelena Tripanov.
I'm not a political person. I'm not the one with the answers, but I do know this. No other country in the world would have 239 of their people being kept hostage and not do anything about it. No politics, just bring them home now. 24 days is way too long for these people to be kept in captivity.
According to Israeli authorities, at least 239 hostages were taken captive by Hamas gunmen during the October 7th attack, which killed at least 1,400 people. The presence of the hostages in Gaza has complicated Israel forces' ground operation in the enclave, but Netanyahu has rejected calls for a ceasefire. Gaza health authorities say more than 8,300 people, many of them children, have been killed in Israeli attacks since Hamas' assault.
The ground action actually creates the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility of getting our hostages out, because Hamas will not do it unless they're under pressure. They simply will not do it.
On Monday, Israel said its forces had freed their first hostage during its Gaza ground offensive, a female soldier who Hamas captured in its October 7th raid. Israel's security agency released a photo of the soldier, Ori Megadish, surrounded by family members after her rescue. In her hometown of Kiryat Gat, residents cheered after news of her release. Since the October 7th attack, Hamas has released 4 hostages through back-channel efforts coordinated by Qatar.
Meanwhile, residents in Gaza say they feel isolated from the rest of the world as the death toll in the Palestinian territory tops 8,000. That's according to the Hamas-controlled health ministry. The World Health Organization says a public health catastrophe is unfolding in Gaza. Violence has also surged in the West Bank since the war began. Yan Boechat is in East Jerusalem for us, and he joins me now. Yan, thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you. You've just returned from the West Bank. What is the latest where you are?
Today, it's a day that the Palestinian Authority called for a day of rage, a day of protest, and they called for a strike as well. As you can see here in Jerusalem, I'm very close to the old city. Everything is closed, the same in Ramallah and other cities in the West Bank. Last night, at least 5 people were killed there during Israeli incursions into refugee camps in different cities in the West Bank. In Jenin, at least 3 Islamic Jihad fighters were killed by Israel drone. The situation here is very, very tense, and nobody knows what's going to happen here in the next days or weeks.
I mean, on the one hand, Yan, people, of course, outraged by the climbing civilian death toll. On the other hand, of course, there are concerns of a wider war in the region. What are ordinary people telling you?
People are fearing exactly this, that this war that is happening in Gaza can come to this side, to the West Bank. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of rage, and there's a lot of uncertainty. People don't know what's going to happen, but talking to a lot of people, they say negotiations with Israel seems to be impossible now. And a lot of people that I've talked to showed support to actions and factions like Hamas, factions that confront Israel with violence. This is not good for the West Bank as well, because it seems people there are just getting tired of what's going on.
All right, Yan Boechat there in East Jerusalem for us. Yan, take care of yourself, stay safe. We'll see you soon. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, a war of words has erupted at the United Nations Security Council over the Middle East crisis. The Security Council has the primary responsibility for international peace and security, but it is deep in deadlock over the Israel-Hamas war. Let's go now to VOA UN Bureau Chief Margaret Besheer. She's at the UN headquarters in New York for us. Margaret, always good to see you. We saw pressure and tension around the Israel-Hamas war mounting in the Middle East, in Washington, around the world. What does that pressure and tension look like at the United Nations?
Well, Hayde, here it's a daily, if not near hourly call for a humanitarian ceasefire. We are hearing that from the UN Secretary General on down to his heads of agencies, to every spokesperson in this building, and from many, many member states, particularly in the global south. Yesterday, Bolivia said they were cutting relations with Israel over the situation of Palestinian civilians. We heard from the UN refugee chief yesterday. He does an annual briefing to the Security Council on the displaced people around the world. 114 million people displaced currently. And he scolded the council, telling them that it's their rivalries and divisions that are preventing some conflicts and wars from being settled, and the humanitarians are having to pick up the pieces of people's lives which are directly affected by it. So we're hearing lots of anger, but no action. There's no humanitarian ceasefire. On Friday, the UN General Assembly took matters into their own hands because the council is paralyzed, and they overwhelmingly adopted a resolution calling for a humanitarian truce. But Israel has said they won't enact it. As you mentioned, they say this will benefit Hamas, so they won't stop. It's also important to say that the UN General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding.
Right, and that's why it's so important to have all eyes on the UN Security Council, which does actually, in reality, should have some muscle here. But it's held an emergency meeting on the Israel-Hamas war this week, plenty of meetings last week. What exactly are they trying to hammer out at the Security Council? What can they hammer out? And what did this week's meeting actually accomplish?
Well, as you said, it's a war of words here. In this case, it's a war of what words can we accept in a resolution calling for some sort of pause, some sort of truce, some sort of ceasefire. These words mean something in diplomacy. They have different implications. And so this is part of what's going on here. There are also issues with the U.S., which is Israel's closest ally. They don't want to they want language that says Israel has the right to defend itself. That's very important to both Israel and the United States. Some other countries don't think that language is so necessary. So there's a lot of bickering about these points. In the meantime, as many ambassadors point out, people are dying. But we did have one good bit of news today. The Egyptians have opened Rafah crossing, and there are ambulances taking out about 81 severely injured Palestinians, bringing them into Egypt. It's something that's been in the works for weeks now. Qatar has reportedly also been involved in getting this to happen. The World Health Organization said there's about 65 ambulances, equipped teams to go into Gaza to bring out these wounded people, and they will be treated in Egypt. So it's a glimmer of hope, but then there's more than 21,000 seriously injured people, according to figures coming out of Gaza. So they still need help, and the aid is not getting in at the scale and speed and continuity that is needed. We've only seen about 217 trucks with food, water, and medical supplies go in since October 21st. And if you compare that to before October 7th, more than 450 trucks a day, commercial and aid trucks were going into Gaza to support more than 2.2 million people. So it's just, as the UN Secretary General said yesterday, it's totally inadequate. And they are just begging for more aid to go in and fuel, because they really need that to, it's a lifeline to their operations to power the trucks and also the hospitals.
Well, we'll take good news whenever and from wherever it comes. Thank you so much for your great reporting. VOA's UN Bureau Chief, Margaret Besheer, speaking to me there from New York. Well, we're going to take a short break here on Straight Talk Africa, and when we return, where and when will it all end? We'll look at the politics and the pressure building on the streets at the UN, as well as Israel and the United States. You're watching a special edition of Straight Talk Africa. We'll be back in a moment.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.
According to IMF statistics and surveys, women in sub-Saharan Africa continue to struggle to secure corporate employment due to limitations such as education, gender discrimination, sexual harassment, and cultural norms. This week on Our Voices, we discuss a woman's journey to securing gainful employment in the formal sector and challenges they face, as well as possible solutions. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
You're watching VOA's Red Carpet. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Thank you so much for joining us each week. Right here on Red Carpet, we bring you the latest in
You're watching a special edition of Straight Talk Africa. Welcome back. This is the time for war. Those are the words of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as he vowed to press ahead with Israel's war on Hamas, even as Hamas holds more than 200 hostages taken from Israel during its October surprise attack on the Jewish state. Pressure is building at the UN, in Israel, and on the streets of capitals worldwide for a ceasefire in Israel's war on Hamas. While in the US, President Joe Biden is facing a revolt from some members of his own Democratic Party over his unwavering support for Israel. VOA's White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara reports.
As Israeli airstrikes continue in Gaza, including this one on the Al-Shati refugee camp, an open letter to President Joe Biden from advocacy group the National Muslim Democratic Council, demanding that he broker a ceasefire by 5 p.m. Tuesday or face the consequence of millions of American Muslims withholding their support for his re-election next year.
We know for a fact that our community will make a difference in the battleground states. And I think Democratic Party leaders are paying attention, and they are afraid of what's happening. And they're sending messages to the White House that this is going to hurt our chances in 2024.
More than 1 million Muslim voters cast a ballot in the 2020 election, turning out in numbers large enough to potentially swing the presidential race in some battleground states. Muslim and Arab Americans traditionally vote for Democratic candidates, but a shift may be coming. A new poll by the Arab American Institute showed support for Biden dropped among Arab American voters from 59% in the 2020 election to 17% ahead of 2024.
We're going to continue engaging with the Muslim community, the Arab American community, and Palestinian American leaders to hear their concerns.
In contrast, Jewish Americans are deeply appreciative of Biden's support of Israel.
Israel is an important issue, remains a very important issue to Jewish voters. It's an issue about which there's a very high emotional attachment between Jewish Americans and support of Israel.
About 7 million Jews live in the U.S., the same number as in Israel. They make up 3% of the U.S. electorate. Biden is also widely praised in Israel. He has been urging Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to conduct the war following international humanitarian law to protect civilians.
What he's saying to Israel, to help me, to help you. If you give maximum effort to fight in the right way, according to the laws of war, then it makes it easier for me to support you and get support from you in the international community and at home in America and in the Democratic Party.
Polls show more Republicans than Democrats approve of Biden's decision to send weapons to Israel.
I do think that there isn't a lot of room for Republicans here, whether it's Trump or the Republicans in Congress, to outflank Biden on support for Israel.
Meanwhile, there's growing pressure for a ceasefire, including from anti-war protesters during Tuesday's congressional hearing. Administration officials have advocated for humanitarian pauses to allow aid to reach civilians, but say a ceasefire at this point will only benefit Hamas. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
So where and when will the crisis in the Middle East end, and what is the geopolitical fallout from what we're seeing unfolding in the Middle East? My guest here in studio is Michael Walsh. He's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Michael, a warm welcome to you. Thanks for coming in to talk to us again. As we just saw in that story there, US President Joe Biden under pressure at home. We're just over a year away from the next US presidential election. Could President Biden pay a real hefty price for his what seems to be unwavering support for Israel at this point? And is he likely to press ahead with that support, no matter the political or even financial cost?
I mean, the reporting that's come out in the last 24 hours suggests he's already paying quite a price at home. So it's a very divisive issue, not just in the United States, but globally. And when you look at the situation in the US, I mean, it's divided the Democratic electorate. The majority of Muslim Americans identified as Democrats at the last election. And the question is that going to happen in the next election? We don't know, but what we see is early indications is that people are very upset and they're very disappointed in the person that they voted for within that community.
Is there a bit of a personal bond there too? I've heard Benjamin Netanyahu always refer to Joe and I go back a long way, and there's been talk about the Biden and Netanyahu bond. How strong is that bond? Does it go beyond politics?
I mean, there's an ideological bond to some extent, right? So when we look at the sort of narrative that's come out when people are talking about this, when Biden's talking about this, I mean, Biden has expressed almost an endorsement of Zionism, which is an ideology that exists in the political domain, and that has huge implications. And so that perception that Biden is a Zionist and that Biden is supporting the ideology that the Israeli state supports and that Netanyahu supports is part of why this blowback's happening with Muslim Americans. This blowback was happening before the Gaza incident that happened on August 7th too, with the terrorist attack by Hamas and then the siege of Gaza. So this is not something that's brand new by any stretch of the imagination.
And of course, you know, the president, we're seeing US President Joe Biden start to issue some caution in Israel's direction. In a speech recently, he said that Israel should learn from America and its experiences post 9/11 and to not be consumed by rage. What kind of leverage then does President Biden have to pressure Benjamin Netanyahu to do maybe things that Benjamin Netanyahu does not want to do right now?
Right now, we want to talk about leverage against Netanyahu. You know, as a president of the United States, we usually, you know, would perceive or expect that there'd be leadership on a global stage, and that this would extend beyond just the conflict parties. It would extend to everyone else in the international system. And the problem we're seeing with this conflict is that the credibility of the U.S. on the issue and the leadership of the U.S. on the issue, particularly because of how the U.S. managed the issue in the 48 to 72 hours after the incident and the inability to get global consensus around the fact that this was a terrorism attack and to basically identify Hamas as a terrorist organization. The failure to do that has had knock-on effects. And then when you see sort of the visit to the Middle East and to the Arab world and the conversations and this sort of changing positioning of the U.S. on various things, you know, that has an impact. And so right now, the U.S. leadership on this issue has been questioned. And China and Russia are trying to exert leadership on the world stage, and others are as well. The problem is that there isn't a single leader in the international system right now that can convene the international community to try to work forward. So there's camps, there's factions, and this sort of fracturing of the international system, not just around major powers, but even around some non-major powers who are playing leadership roles. There isn't a single leader right now, and that's having a huge impact on trying to bring sort of a resolution to this in the short term as something like a ceasefire.
And if we look at the state of the world today, is that still what is needed? I mean, America has always seen itself as being that very leader that you've talked about. But if we look at a changing geopolitical order, is what is needed still one single leader, or can many leaders who perhaps agree on something emerge from a situation like this?
On this specific issue, the problem is I don't know who could be the single leader. The problem is that when you try to bring states to the table, everybody has conflicts of interest on this issue. I mean, this is a long-standing issue. It's one of the rare cases in the international system where everybody has conflicts of interest and everybody's taken positions. So it's hard for anybody to be seen as a neutral party to come in and to sit. I mean, we've talked many times about South Africa. You know, South Africa wants to take that role. The Israelis certainly don't see South Africa as a neutral party in this, even though South Africa wants to take that role. The U.S. wants to play the role, but the U.S. is failing at the ability to do that. You know, other parties are trying to as well. And the one thing I think is really interesting is the position China has taken on all of this, because they've kind of taken a back seat. I mean, they are making public statements, they are doing things, but they're letting everybody else demonstrate that they don't have leadership on this. And that plays into their strengths moving forward as they try to challenge the world order.
You know, we spoke earlier, or Margaret at least spoke earlier about, you know, some good news coming out in all of this, as small as the good moments are. But there appears to be some deals that are being reached in the background, especially when it comes to things like the release of hostages. We saw critically injured Palestinians arriving in Egypt for treatment, hundreds of foreign nationals now being able to leave Gaza for Egypt. Can you give us some insight into who's likely involved in brokering these types of deals in this conflict?
Well, there's multiple parties you have to broker the deal with. So obviously on the Egyptian border, Egypt's one of the parties you have to broker the deal with. And there's been shuttle diplomacy by many people going back and forth to Egypt to try to make this happen. The U.S. has been playing a big role in that. But on the Gaza side of the border, Hamas is a major party. And as many people have said, and this is the reporting coming out from people who are in Gaza, Hamas has been an obstacle to letting people out. especially foreign nationals, because it's not just the hostages they took in Israel. You know, the Palestinian people who go back, who have dual citizenship or who have foreign citizenship, who are visiting family, who can't leave, they're effectively hostages as well, if they're not prevented from leaving. So there's a lot of different hostages we have at stake here. And so Hamas loses leverage once foreign nationals are out of Gaza. And so it's not in their interest unless they get something big in exchange, whether it's fuel, whether it's food, whatever it is. But they want something in exchange. And so I think that the issue we have here, and that's where Qatar comes in. So the Qataris have been playing a huge role in all of this. But as the Qataris said, you know, once you start moving to a major military incursion into Gaza, you've now taken that sort of political space you have to negotiate a settlement. Mediation becomes really difficult when guns are shooting. And so that's where we're at right now. And so the prospect for hostage releases, I mean, as one of your reporters was talking about with the Israeli soldier who was released, you know, that's coming at the tip of the bayonet. That's not coming out of people negotiating behind the scenes. And so, you know, whether we can see progress made on this issue in the near term with so much conflict happening in Gaza is unclear.
Michael, just very briefly, you know, of course, African countries with the Russia-Ukraine war was about choosing sides, but are some African countries in this case, with this war, concerned about their own security challenges? Could we see a spillover from the Middle East crisis into some African countries?
There has been a spillover from Syria, there was a spillover from Iraq, from Afghanistan. So we were talking about this in the spring and in the summer about the massive increase in terrorism across Africa and the concern about terrorism across Africa. And we've seen this, and it's motivated, you know, according to coup leaders in the Sahel and other places, it's motivating them to do things, right? And so we already have a concern of spillover effect from all of the instability that exists in Central Asia and the Middle East into Africa. And you see this with even the names of the organizations, you know, ISIS, Mozambique, ISIS, West Africa, ISIS this, right? So I would expect that there is going to be a significant spillover effect from this, because this is something that's highly incendiary amongst many communities, because people feel very close to this issue. And so that will be a strong motivation that these organizations can use to recruit more people and to commit more attacks, and potentially be the motivation for their leadership to do things they wouldn't have otherwise done.
And embolden them, essentially. Just very quickly, will African countries also start feeling the economic pain from this conflict in the Middle East?
We all might feel the economic pain. The World Bank report that came out a couple of days ago talks of two crises, two shocks. One would be an energy shock and one would be a food shock. And a lot of it comes down to what happens now. So we're going to see the equivalent of, you know, the Arab oil embargo of the 70s scenario. Are we going to see the equivalent of an Iraq war scenario, or are we going to see the equivalent of, you know, a short-term conflict that's going to get, you know, quickly burned out and people are going to come to the table and try to sue for peace? It depends a lot on what happens from here. So there's no clarity. We haven't really felt the severe economic consequences yet, but I think everyone saw what happened with the Ukraine war, and everyone saw what happened with the food crisis there for Africa. And I think that the expectation is, if we don't get this under control quickly, that is, you know, a very severe concern for the leadership of African countries.
Well, we'll keep a close eye on all of this. Michael Walsh, thank you so very much for coming in and giving us your insights. Michael Walsh is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And that is it for this special edition of Straight Talk Africa. Be sure to follow us on social media. A big thank you to all my guests, all our reporters, and all our affiliate stations carrying Straight Talk Africa throughout the African continent. And thank you for always watching and for always listening. From all of us here, goodbye. Thank you very much, Michael.